Hello, hello. It's Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a great sounding track by a band called Tame Impala. Great sounding is actually kind of a weird thing to say about this track because this song, The Less I Know the Better, arguably, it sounds terrible in all the ways that you're not supposed to mess up your mix. This mix breaks so many rules. And this comes from an artist who is, at least on this album, more or less mixing himself. He's had mixing help in the past, but he actually had the great Dave Fridman mix his first full-length record. Dave Fridman, in case you're not familiar with him, he's one of my favorite mixers. I've interviewed him a few times. He's responsible for the Flaming Lips records, which I think broke a lot of ground in making records sound messed up and awesome. And he's done records for Sleater Kinney and Spoon. And this particular record, though, the artist took mixing into their own hands. And Tame Impala are kind of known for being recorded in unusual places and mixed more or less by the artist. And Tame Impala comes up for me often as a reference when I work with indie pop artists, indie rock artists. People love the vibe and tone of these records. And in just a few minutes, we're going to start listening to these together. I have my Pro Tools screen here, and we will listen through to these records. And rather than going through stems or multi-tracks and talking about exactly what was done, we're going to take the approach we often take on this mixed breakdown series, which is a critical listening approach, where we're going to listen to this song section by section and talk about and figure out exactly what's going on, what makes this mix special, what makes it unique. And I'll tell you that one of the things that comes up a lot for me when I'm dealing with clients who bring up Tame Impala as a reference for me when they come to me as a mastering engineer is it'll often be from artists where they're afraid to do all the things that Tame Impala does. And the only way you're going to get records that sound like The Less I Know the Better, the only way you're going to get there is by breaking a ton of rules. And we're going to talk about some of the rules that are broken on this track and whether you would want to or should break these rules in your own productions. Because honestly, sometimes I get Tame Impala as a reference from clients and I'm like, okay, your record sounds nothing like Tame Impala. Let me just give it a mastering treatment that would take it more in that direction. I'm just going to blow this thing out. And sometimes when I do that, people are like, oh my goodness, that's awesome. What did you do? And I say, all the things you were afraid to do while you're mixing. And sometimes people say, that's cool, but I don't want my record to sound like that. Maybe I just think Tame Impala are cool. I don't actually want to sound like Tame Impala. So we're going to talk about whether this kind of treatment is suitable for your own stuff. Before we get too deep into it, let me bring up the screen here. I'm going to just give the briefest of shout outs to our sponsors. How do you sponsor this podcast if you like it? The most important way to sponsor this podcast is to be a sponsor yourself, and you can do that by sponsoring yourself. Check out one of our great full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, Compression Breakthroughs, and EQ Breakthroughs. Honestly, if you want to have sounds like you're going to hear on Tame Impala records, you're going to have to get comfortable with compression. And Compression Breakthroughs is possibly a course you want to check out. It will change the way that you hear and use compression forever for the better, whether you want to use it extremely tastefully or in extremely blown out ways like sometimes Tame Impala do. All right, without any further ado, let's get right into it and let's start listening to the opening of this song, The Less I Know the Better by Tame Impala. If you're here for the live stream, let me know if you need me to adjust anything with the levels between my voice and the track. Here we go. All right, I'm going to stop it right here and let's talk about what we're hearing in the beginning. This is an interesting thing where this song has so much in common with all the other mixed breakdowns we've done so far. This song has about 1.5 billion streams on it on Spotify currently. The main music video for this song has another 760 million streams on YouTube. And all the other big tracks that we've looked at so far in the series do the same thing in the beginning that this song does. They start out with a kind of band limited sound. You don't get the full frequency spectrum of music in the first handful of bars. We have a relatively lo-fi sounding intro, and then bam, when the band drops in, we get a whole nother octave or more of extension to the low end and more high frequency information. So we go from mid-rangey to full range. And this is a cheap trick that as listeners, we should stop falling for, but it's a cheap trick that works. Literally every single one of these. We checked out Toxic. We checked out Pharrell Williams' Happy. I think the only track that didn't precisely do this was a Soundgarden track that we listened to last week. But even in that Soundgarden track, there was a bit of this kind of thing going on where we start mid-rangey and then we go full spectrum. The other big thing here, just from arrangement perspective, before we get into the mixing, is just how short and tight this intro is. We're presented with really compelling rhythmic hooks. The introduction starts off super solid rhythmically, and we are about 10 seconds in before we get our first total scene shift. And then we're going another 10 to 15 seconds here before we get a scene shift again where the vocals come in. And this is something that is constantly happening on the biggest records. This is partly an arrangement thing. We're not talking about just mix things here, but that's something I want you to look at in your own productions. How quickly are you hooking listeners? And how quickly are you giving them a scene shift? And how quickly are you getting to the point of the song? Now, let's zero in on this introduction and just think about what the elements are in this introduction. And let's talk about the tier levels. For those of you who haven't tuned in one of these episodes before, I think one of the most important things to think about in mixing is the tiers that each instrument belong in. You basically have an A tier of instruments, the instruments that are the main point of the track in that given section. Those are your A tier instruments. You've got your B tier instruments. Those are your main supporting elements. And then you've got your C tier elements, which are the everything else. The things that are not supposed to, they're supposed to add color, flavor, intrigue without getting in the way. So in each of these sections, the introduction and then the beginning of our first instrumental section, ask yourself, what's the primary instrument in those sections? What are the supporting elements and what's the everything else? Let's analyze exactly what's going on. Here's the intro. All right, so before we get into the vocal, and the vocal treatments on here are extremely interesting. We'll talk about how he's getting those. What are the primary instruments for you? For me, the lead instrument in this section, like in so many Tame Impala songs, is the bass. And one of the things that also happens in a lot of Tame Impala tracks is they sound wide, and they sound wide in an unusual way. One of the reasons I think Tame Impala tracks often sound so wide is that the drum kit is not wide. The drum kit is fairly mono straight down the center, heavily compressed, and you have a bass track. I'm kind of wrong when I say straight down the center. There's actually a lot of panned drums in Tame Impala, but we're not talking about panned drums as in stereo panning. We're not talking about extreme left-right spread on the drum kit. We're talking about relatively mono-focused drums that might be panned a little bit to one side. In this track, I feel like the kick drum for me is leaning to the left side. Tell me if you're hearing the same thing. And I'll just in a second go ahead and swap the left and right and tell me if you feel that the whole drum kit is leaning to one side. But the drum kit itself is relatively mono. The bass is very mono, especially in this introduction. And this allows other elements to be panned out super wide. And we aren't distracted by extremely wide panned toms and cymbals. So listen to the change in tone also of the drum kit and the bass going from this lo-fi intro section into the main section. And for me, the main characters are definitely 100% the bass, possibly followed by the snare drum. And I want to talk a little bit about how the bass is mixed too. So listen to this intro one more time. I'm going to flip it for you here. Beautiful. So that is our first vocal section. And for me, the main characters here are kind of like the bass is A tier, and in a very odd way, the vocal feels like an A tier element with its effect, but it's so far in the back. This is an extremely distant sounding vocal. We have this really interesting perspective where the bass feels surprisingly up front, and then the vocal sounds kind of behind it, but it and its effect are loud enough that it still takes top priority, even though it feels distant to our ear. One of the other things that's going on here is there's a ton of effect on the vocal. And one of the first rules that's being broken here is just how much reverb is on the vocal and how bright it is. This is potentially one of the most common amateurish mistakes to make on mixing records, is having vocals that are way too verbed out, way too affected, and inappropriately so. But here it doesn't come across as inappropriate at all. There's a couple other things going on in this vocal. One, like the drums, it is heavily compressed. It's really dynamically consistent. A big part of the Tame Impala drum sound and the cymbal sound of a lot of records comes from these things being really smashed with compression. Relatively quietly played drums that are just made to sound so much larger than they should by using lots of compression and limiting. And this is by no means one of the most compressed Tame Impala drum sounds at all. In fact, we'll listen to a little bit of We Only Go Backwards from, I believe it was the prior record, Lonerism, in just a second to hear some even more aggressively treated drums and even more significantly panned drums. But the interesting thing here about the vocal is it is probably the brightest element in a way in this mix. Like there's a lot of lows and low mids carved out of it. It's really dynamically consistent. There's a ton of reverb and other effects. And I'm almost certain that there is compression and limiting happening after the effects on the vocal. And this is part of what makes the sound of the vocal work. And I think this happens on a lot of Tame Impala records. We'd have to ask the man himself, Mr. Impala. If you know his actual name, you can type it here into the chat. I'm going to refer to him as Mr. Impala today. But Mr. Impala, I think on a lot of these records takes this approach of having compression and limiting that's happening after the vocal effects. And if you haven't tried that yet, do. Because this is something that if you're mixing in a conventional way, you're often going to be taking a vocal, maybe applying compression and limiting to that vocal, generally a lot more of it than you think you need to if you're just starting out. And then if you're doing things the conventional way, you're piping that out to an effects send that happens on that might be shared across a bunch of other tracks. So you're sending part of your vocal out to an auxiliary channel that has reverb on it. And then maybe there's some compression and limiting happening at the end of that reverb at the mix bus level, but you're not necessarily applying compression directly after the effects. Sometimes when someone doesn't know how to mix and they do all of the wrong things, they can end up getting interesting sounds just by doing things that are intuitive to them. So a lot of beginning mixers will take a vocal track, put a reverb and delay directly on it. It'll be unique to the vocal, not shared with everything else. And then they'll put other plugins later on the chain after that reverb or delay. And that is quote unquote the wrong way to do things, in that it can be less efficient. You're not necessarily sharing the same effects across all of your instruments, which make the vocal potentially sound like it's removed from the rest of the band. But all of those things, those kinds of things are happening here. The vocal does sound removed from the rest of the band. It has this overly long, cloying reverb effect that isn't shared across all the other instruments. And that's one of the reasons you can get away with this excessive reverb in here. It's because it is something that's not used on everything. If you had this long and this bright of a reverb across everything, I think the mix would probably stink. But the fact that it is just contained to this vocal, and it pulls the vocal into its own world that's separate from the other elements, kind of makes this work. It's an unconventional approach. And that's why a lot of people are afraid to mix like a Tame Impala record is mixed, because it requires you doing these unconventional things. Lots of compression on drums, not trying to make things sound natural. Having the bass be possibly the most prominent element in the entire mix. Having the vocal soundstage be super weird, super loud, but super watery and super far back. Tell me if you're hearing some of those same things. And then we'll talk a little bit about panning choices, which I think are one of the most interesting things that happens in Tame Impala. Here we go again, going from the outro through this first vocal section, sorry, the end of the intro into the first vocal section, and then we'll hit the chorus. I have to stop there to talk a little about the panning, because some of the most important B tier elements in this section, after things like the bass and the snare drum and the kick, which are really kind of prominent here, or we have these background guitars. One of them feels like it's panned slightly to the right, almost centered, and then there's two other incidental guitars that happen further out to the left. In the mix here, there's not a lot of left, center, right technique, which is a way that I recommend often starting with mixes, is that you pan things all the way hard or straight in the center. And then from there, if things aren't exactly the way that you want them, then you can tuck them in. But start with left, center, right. And a lot of great mixers do this. But here, there's a lot more partial panning going on. And sometimes that partial panning happens because an instrument is panned out, and then there's an effect that's more center that pulls it back to the center. But there's just really great use of panning here, where things sound wide but not lopsided. As we're listening to this section, I'm going to give you a different perspective on it, because your hearing might be uneven, like mine and like almost everybody's. I'm going to flip left and right and tell me if anything changes in the mix for you. Here it is, flipped around. Yeah, that was with it flipped around. Do you hear things differently? I feel like I could be totally wrong here, but I feel like on this pass, since it was reversed, I'm going to go back to talking about how it is normally. The kick drum feels like it pulls a little bit to the left. There's a main rhythmic guitar that's kind of in the center and pulls a little bit to the right. And then there's these incidental extra guitars and a kind of chimey synth sound that pull backward to the left, but not all the way to the left. Based on the last pass, it would be the exact opposite of that because we're listening to it backwards. But hopefully you hear some of that. Now let's listen to this going into the next section. And now I want to play a little bit of the beginning of We Only Go Backwards, because it takes some of these ideas and makes them even more extreme. Here we go, back into where the vocal lands. Man, listen to the last vocal note in each of those phrases. The reverb on the vocal is almost as loud as the vocal itself. And I don't think you're going to get that kind of tone without having some compression and or limiting after the effects on the vocal chain. Let's keep going. And of course, we have this gorgeous ring out on this last word in the vocal here. Sounds like a really rapid delay through. At first, I almost feel like it sounds like a spring reverb because that really rapid delay, but it's probably a really rapid delay through some type of weird chamber or digital reverb. So super interesting sounds there. But I don't know, I'm almost going to take it back. I don't know, is the vocal an A-tier instrument or a B-tier instrument here? To me, listening on a full range system, these headphones that go really low, or my main speakers, the lead instruments in this song are almost drum and bass, which is what makes this kind of record the kind of record that producers really love. The bass line becomes super prominent. And the vocals, though, are like right after drums and bass on a full range system, way up there, but they get masked every once in a while. Like when we get into this section here, there is a electric keyboard sound and a guitar sound that are able to compete and fight with a vocal. And our perspective on what's dominant in the mix is constantly changing. And I think that's one of the things that are great about these Tame Impala records is that you're constantly given new things to focus on. There's this kind of trance-like vibe about them where constantly new elements are being pulled into the arrangement and you could focus on them or not focus on them. And part of this comes from these records. I mean, look at this thing. It looks like a sausage. This record is limited like crazy. This is a super hot sounding mix and master. And part of the tone and texture of these Tame Impala records come from using way more compression, way more limiting than you're supposed to use. And if you want records that sound more like Tame Impala records, you have to be unafraid to push things and to push things hard. Dave Fridman is especially known for this, allowing musicians to push him, to push their mixes even harder, and being the guy who doesn't say no to weird requests from the musician. And my understanding, the artist here had the first record mixed by mixed by Dave Fridman, and then went and mixed later records by himself, still having them mastered by Greg Calby. But he probably learned a lot of fearlessness from being in the studio with Dave. And I believe he's also been quoted talking about wanting to emulate some of the sounds that he heard off of some of these Flaming Lips records where the drums are just blown out. If you haven't heard something like Yoshimi Battles the Pink Robots, that record from the Flaming Lips, or the song Race from the Prize that's on Soft Bulletin, these are some records that in the earlier 2000s kind of set a tone for what later indie pop and indie rock records are going to sound like. And another thing I want you to take heart in is this is a really quirky, weird sounding record. It's not clean at all. It doesn't have a really conventional pop song structure, but it's insanely successful. We were recently listening to a Britney Spears song, Toxic, which I think is brilliantly arranged, brilliantly produced. It has 1.5 billion streams on Spotify. Guess what else does? This song has 1.5 billion streams on Spotify. It's been streamed as many times as Britney Spears' biggest song. Now, chances are, if you ask your mom about artists, she's probably heard of Britney Spears, and she probably hasn't heard of Tame Impala. Well, it depends on how cool your mom is. My mom probably doesn't know Tame Impala. Your mom might. I don't know how hip your mom is. Let me know if you have a hip mom in the comment section down below. But it's amazing that a record that sounds like this can be as successful as the biggest pop stars in terms of sheer numbers of streams. So don't be afraid of messing things up. Don't be afraid of pushing things too far. Don't be afraid of just following your gut and your instincts on what things should sound like. Listening to this record reminds me of a conversation I was having just yesterday with an artist who is getting something mastered. And he said, one of his biggest fears, one of his biggest nightmares was the word, is that if you were to find out that something was wrong, that there was a mistake made after the record was already released. And I thought that was really interesting. Because we can all, relate to that. We can all relate to this idea of we got to get everything right in the record. We got to make this record as best as we possibly can make it. Got to make sure the record sounds great. Got to make sure there aren't mistakes on there. How many mistakes are probably on this record? How many mistakes are on some of your favorite records? I think a big thing that you've got to realize is that no one is ultimately going to be grading you on your mix, on your production, on your master, for how accurate it was. Because a really accurate mix would be one that sounded like the song before it was mixed, which would probably sound dumb and not good. Mixing is the creative application of distortion and other forms of processing to make things sound more awesomer. And I'm using distortion loosely here. I'm not talking about total harmonic distortion. When I'm saying distortion, I mean this so broadly, in the most lay sense possible, that when you're EQing a track, you're basically distorting it. Not literally in the terms of adding tons of harmonic distortion, but you're changing it from how it was. You're making it more messed up and less like the original in a way that you think is better. And a record like this encapsulates that approach to the nth degree. So it's so much more important that you get things that sound and feel awesome and inspiring. It's so much more important to do that than to do things correctly, than to make things that sound clean, than to not use too much compression. Now that said, not every record needs to be as blown out as a Tame Impala record. Some records should be way cleaner than this. Sometimes you might be inspired by an artist like this, and then you go to make your own record, and if you were to do the things it would take to make your record sound like this, you would hate it. But we can at least learn, I think, some of that fearlessness from tracks like this. Let's listen to an earlier big hit, probably the first big track from Tame Impala that was off the Lonerism album. This one is slightly less successful, with only about 500 million streams on it. It's called We Only Go Backwards. And I would say this production is not quite as impressive in a way as the mixes on the record we were just listening to is called Currents. This one we're about to hear is called Lonerism. It's slightly more of a lo-fi record, but gorgeous sounding record in its own weird way. Let's have a little bit of a listen to the beginning of We Only Go Backwards. Give me 1 second to open up our frequency analyzer here so we can look at it as we're listening and possibly do some left-right swapping, because there's some interesting stuff going on here in panning. Here we go. So what do you notice, first off, about how the bass is mixed on this song, We Only Go Backwards? If you didn't catch it, it's panned to the left. Listen to it again. Do you think it's panned 100% to the left or slightly to the left? Hear it one more time. And another interesting thing in the song is, just like in the prior one, it feels like the bass is the lead instrument in the song, and the vocal almost sounds like a supporting element to the bass. The bass line is 100% more complex than the vocal melody is. The bass texture is just as interesting and weird as the vocal texture is. It's probably the loudest thing in the mix. Like, the A-tier instrument is the bass line. Maybe that's followed by the drums, and maybe that's followed by the vocal. And the vocal, again, is allowed to sit way back in the soundstage. It's really well dynamically controlled. We're removing some significant low mids and lows from the vocal. And it has a really predominant effect that's not shared by a whole bunch of other elements in the song. There's no other element that sounds as reverby in exactly the same way as the vocal does. And here, there's actually a little bit of spread that's happening to the drums, but I don't know if that stereo spread on the drums that I'm getting a sense for is actually from even stereo mics. It could be, but I feel like there might be some type of stereo reverb or stereo delay that we're getting a little bit of that snare splash through. But here, one of the most iconic things about what's happening in the drum kit to me is not just the cool grungy sound of the kick drum, not just the cool flattened muffled sound of the snare drum with tons of compression on it to bring out the details, but it's the sound of some of these cymbal crashes. And the only way you're going to get cymbal crashes like these is to use entirely too much compression. Usually really fast attack compression with a fairly fast release that's going to shave off the initial transient of the cymbal and then allow the sustain of it to blossom. So it almost sounds like a reverse cymbal. And this was something that Dave Fridman popularized in his early mixes, and a lot of other bands have done it since. But you can find this kind of effect going way back to the Beatles. There's a Beatlesy vibe in some of the Tame Impala tracks, and this one arguably has a little bit of a Beatles vibe. You listen to a track called She Said, She Said by the Beatles, where you have this almost reverse cymbal effect. So listen for that as it comes in. Listen to the panning of the bass, how loud it is compared to everything else in the mix. And listen for just how distant and far back those vocals are, with probably plenty of compression and dynamic control happening after the effects, and listen for the cymbals and how they swell, and recognize that you're only going to get these kinds of drum sounds and these kinds of bass sounds and these kinds of vocal sounds with way too much compression and limiting, probably more than you're already using. And we'll talk exactly about what units to use and stuff in just a second. Yeah, that was kind of a Beatlesy transition there. It goes beautifully back into the main riff, but it's almost like the song is a duet between the vocal and the bass, if we're thinking of lines that we're going to follow along to melodically. And then everything else is just adding really gorgeous texture. And those are probably the two primary characters. And you find that kind of vibe a lot throughout Tame Impala. Man, there's so many different tracks we could pull up here, and each one of them is going to have a weird idiosyncratic thing about the way it's mixed. Oh, I'm realizing now I'm not sharing my Pro Tools screen. This is one of the problems with being totally live. There we go. Now you should have it back up. So yeah, just absolutely gorgeous, weird sounding mixes. And some of the compressors used here, I think the favorite compressor in the Tame Impala world would probably be like the DBX 165. I've heard mentioned a lot. And you can also hear the sound a lot of, there's that Shure level lock that I know that Dave Fridman is a big fan of. Soundtoys, one of the sponsors of this podcast, regular sponsor, actually makes I think they're the only ones I know of that make a plug-in emulation of the Shure level lock. It's called the Devil Lock. Awesome sounding compressor. So much fun to use for things like crushing drums. But the general approach on these things is going to be using those character compressor limiters, often ones that have fast attack times and fast release times, so there could be some exceptions here, and just using a ton of them in parallel to the point where it could even dwarf the original sound that you have. So those are some of my main takeaways here, just the allowing yourself to do odd panning choices, basses that are panned somewhat to the left, kick drums potentially, in some of these cases drums on some of these songs are panned a little bit to one side or the other, allowing other elements to not sound pretty. I mean, there are synths in here that often have a kind of buzzy saturation on them that sounds like it's coming from too fast pumping limiting, possibly across the whole mix and master. And I think one of the biggest things you can take out of listening to Tame Impala is just, if you want weird, interesting sounding records, be unafraid. Don't be precious. Don't worry about making mistakes in what you're doing. Instead, worry about the vibe of the track, whether you have an arrangement that is constantly surprising people and constantly shepherding them through the song in a way that makes it hard to turn off the song. And be really conscious about what the main points are in the song. Here in the Tame Impala mix, we're unafraid to say the most compelling elements here are the bass and vocal. How do we make them stay the most compelling things? Even when they're not the loudest things, because the vocal sometimes isn't the most loud thing in the mix. But it's always extremely noticeable because some of these effects that will be like a throw off to the left, a delay repeat off to the left, that brings our attention back to the vocal, even if the vocal isn't super loud in the mix. So those are some of my takeaways. Let me know what some of your takeaways are. One of the best ways to really improve at mixing, I think, is to listen to other people's records in this kind of critical way, and then take that same critical listening approach to your own records and figure out what are the differences between what I'm doing in my records and my mixes and what's happening in my favorite mixes out there. And you're going to find out some interesting things. You might be finding out, hey, I really love Tame Impala records. Why does my bass sound like that? And in part, it's because, well, you didn't really write an extremely interesting bass line that should be super loud and super upfront in the mix. Or maybe you did write a really compelling bass line, but you're afraid to put a ton of compression and limiting on it and make it really loud. With vocals, you could say, why don't I have these weird signature sounds? Well, are you putting the same vocal effect on your vocal as everything else in the mix? Because the vocal effect is never going to stand out as a signature sound unless there's some contrast between that weird vocal sound you're going for and the rest of the mix. If you're just equally applying whole heaps of reverb to everything in the mix, and the same exact effect profile is shared by the vocal and the snare drum and the guitars and the overheads and the synths, then all of a sudden the vocal isn't going to separate out from the rest of the mix in this unusual way. If you're using a ton of effects, can you make it so the ton of effect on a vocal don't sound extremely scattered and haphazard? One way to do that would be to really glue things like delay and reverb with compression and limiting that are happening after them. Do you want records that sound blown out and weird and interesting and have like a ton of texture to them? Using too much in the ways of saturation, compression, limiting can be your friend. Using weird character compressors. One of the reasons these records have this kind of unique sound isn't just because there's a Shure level lock on them, and you should also use a Shure level lock. I mean, it's not going to be a unique sound if every single indie pop band in the entire world are all using the same compressor. But the fact that artists like these and a producer like Dave Fridman is willing to say, I'm going to use a different compressor than everyone else does, that's part of what makes these records sound different. So if you're looking to emulate others, sure, go and try to find the same exact equipment they used. And that's one lesson you could take from checking out a Tame Impala record is, I'm going to find out all of the different guitars and basses and drums and pedals and compressors and EQs that they use, and I'm going to use the same ones. If you want to emulate a Tame Impala record, that's a totally valid approach. But a totally different thing that you could learn is just the confidence to say, wait a second, the reason these guys sound different and weird and unusual is because they're using things that not everyone else uses. Maybe I should also use things that are not the same as what everyone else uses. And I don't have to be so precious as to say, I need exactly the right A to D converters and exactly the right preamps and exactly the right compressors and exactly the right vocal mics to get the correct sounds. I mean, so many of the things on these records are weird. There was a Shure SM57 used as a kick drum mic, I think, on their first record. They're using a Rode K2 microphone, which is just an unusual tube microphone. It has its own distinctive sound, but it's not like a super duper popular iconic microphone, but that mic is all over everything. I think a lot of the vocals are done on a Sennheiser MD421. And again, this isn't to say that you should do all your vocals in the Sennheiser MD421, although it's a totally underrated vocal mic. It's to say, like, you don't have to do things the way that everybody else is doing them if you want to stand out and be different. So those would be some of my biggest takeaways here. I hope some of them are useful. If you want to go really deep and take this kind of critical listening approach to your own records, one thing you can do is become a member of this channel. We're going to have our next members-only mix feedback session in just another couple of weeks here. You can sign up right now. It's only $5 a month, which is so stupid cheap. You get access to live Q&As where we'll answer any of the questions that you may have about audio technology, mixing, producing, how it works, the science of sound. But we also get these mixed feedback sessions where we'll listen to your tracks under the microscope and the tracks of a whole bunch of other members under the microscope in this way and talk about what separates them from their favorite sounding records. What's the low-hanging fruit? How should you be EQing your kick drum differently to how you are now if you're going for a specific result that you're not getting yet? What could be improved about your vocal treatments? These are things that we can go into in great detail. In the meantime, don't be afraid to go out there and do crazy stuff. If you want some plugins that help you do crazy stuff, Soundtoys, one of the sponsors of this podcast, check out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. Check out their Devil Lock plugin or their Devil Lock Deluxe. this is a plugin that is, if you want to emulate some of the types of compression that are used on some of these records, that's one that I know is Dave Fridman is a big fan of and has been on a bunch of these Tame Impala records. So definitely check out Soundtoys, particularly the Devil-Lock, and let me know what you think of it. Also, a big shout out and thanks to our other most important sponsor, which is you. If you've been checking out the audio-only version of this podcast and this is useful for you, please go and consider giving us a 5-star rating and review. It really does help spread the word. And also, consider, if you are on the YouTube version, giving us a like, hitting subscribe, leaving a comment. All that stuff really does help the algorithm pick up this stuff and share these gorgeous Tame Impala mixes with more people, as well as my yakking about them. I hope some of this has been useful to you. Thanks for hanging out with me. This is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. I'll see you next time.